Allora, stiamo registrando, ok? E dunque, tra un e l'altro ce l'abbiamo fatta finalmente e abbiamo oggi un nuovo seminario organizzato dal gruppo Abstraction, Unlocking Meaning from Experience Through Language. Questo seminario di oggi che abbiamo l'onore di ospitare vede come speaker la professoressa Gabriella Vigliocco. I'm gonna switch to English now because Gabriella is going to have her talk in English. And Gabriella is professor of the psychology of language at the University College of London, where she works on psychological and neural mechanisms of human language use, with a special emphasis on how conceptual and linguistic information are integrated. So she's working on, generally speaking, on the relationship between language and thought in spoken and sign languages, and on the representation of abstract knowledge. And this is quite relevant for our research group as well as for our course on lingua e linguaggio. I see some of the students. Hi. Gabriella is also principal investigator of an ERC advanced grant project called, with the acronym ECO-LANG, which is focused on language learning and processing in real-world settings. So in real-world settings, language is analyzed in her project in real-world settings, namely in a rich, face-to-face, multimodal environment, not just by looking at texts. With her research group, they collected a corpus of real-time conversations between adults and children, and they are analyzing it, and maybe she's going to talk to us about her project. So I feel very, very honored to have Gabriella here today. Gabriella is also, luckily for us, a member of the advisory board of the Abstraction project, which I coordinate here in Bologna. I'm very thankful to her for being here this week to share her expertise and experience with the whole Abstraction group and providing fruitful feedback and ideas that hopefully will lead to further collaborations and cross-pollination between the two research groups. So without any extra delay, I am now introducing Gabriella Vigliocco, and thank you for being here, and we look forward to listen to your talk.
Very kind. I'm very, very happy to be here. I remember having seen a draft at the beginning of the Abstraction project and thinking, yes, this is really exciting work. So I'm really pleased to be a member of the advisory board. Okay, what I'm presenting today is some work that cuts across my main ERC project. And it's really looking at one interesting phenomenon that we usually do not consider so much. And I'm going to introduce it with a little bit of a simple example. Now, just imagine that tomorrow morning you step outside your front door and you see an alien in underpants. Now, this is rather unlikely, but think about what I've just done. I've used a few words, a couple of sentences, not very much. And I got you to think about something that is, well, borderline realistic or not. And maybe for some of you, you even developed a mental image of what this may look like. And in particular, perhaps if you have children who read children's books from British authors like Claire Freeman, you may think about something like this, which is the way in which in the books the alien in underpants is represented. What this simple example illustrates is how language can be about things that are not here and now. The ability of language to evoke things that are past, in another room, imaginary, hypothetical, is called displacement and has been considered as one of the core features of language. Despite this, when we study language development and language processing, we tend to ignore the fact that indeed language in a very fluid manner can be about the here and now, as well as about aliens in underpants. Now, in particular, what we see in research is that language that is looking at the development, how children learn words, for example, tends to focus on situated language, tends to focus, let me just, close this, tends to focus on cases in which the language is actually about what is right here now. Although it's definitely the case that there are plenty of opportunities for children to learn new words in situations where the objects are not there. When we study how adults process language, sorry, I'm not quite sure how to get myself in view there. I'm coming in and out. Let me just, I move this and I come, no, I need to come further this way. I don't know where I'm supposed to go. Here is good, okay. When we study adults, most of the time we're looking at language in a displaced sense. Although, of course, this is not the only way in which we use language. We use language also to talk about the here and now. And here is a very famous cook in the UK, Jamie Oliver, talking about a recipe. So, two questions that my group has been addressing is, whether communication in situated as well or an in displaced context differ, and whether indeed we process language in different manner in situated and displaced contexts. So the first question is more concerned about what the speaker does in situated and displaced context. The second question is concerned with what a listener does. Okay, and one thing that I believe is really, really important is that in order to tackle questions like this one, we actually need to move away from looking at language in very reductionist type of experiments in the lab. And we need to start to look at how people use language in the real world. And the work that I'm presenting today is all about research done on real world language. Okay, so this is a slide for Marianna. What does displacement has to do with abstraction? Well, I would argue that displacement, in fact, is a form of abstraction, because indeed, displaced language is not about what is available to perceive or to act upon, and because it requires developing in learning or retrieving in processing mental representation without the support of the here and now. So in this respect, I would argue that indeed displacement is a form of abstraction that you guys need to pay attention to. Me too, obviously. Okay, now, given these two broad questions, what I'm going to do today in the first part is address more specific type of question. That is, whether I'm going to be looking at language development, and we will ask to what extent caregivers use different communicative strategies when talking to their young children, and in particular here, the children are between 2 and 4 years of age. So a period in which they are learning new words in buckets by the day. And then I'm going to switch gears. And I'm going to tell you about a study that we carried out looking at how the brain processes words differently in situated and displaced contexts. So let me start with my first part. And this is work that uses the Ecolang corpus, and I'll talk a little bit about it in a second. And that has been carried out by a great many people. But in particular, for what I'm presenting today, the two main players have been Yasmin Motamelli, who was postdoc in my group, and now she is working for the government, for the insight team, behavioral insight team at the government, and Margherita Muggiano, who's actually here in Bologna, who worked with me as a postdoc for a while, And then she came back to Bologna to become a fully qualified interpreter for the linguaggio dei segni italiano, which is what she does right now. And then a number of other people. Okay, so why is it important and interesting to look at displacement, considering vocabulary development, language development? Well, first of all, as I was mentioning before already, the language is not just about the here and now that caregivers use toward their children, and displaced language offers indeed a number of opportunities for learning. But the question is really, how can the child process displaced words? There's nothing there. So where is Bobo the cat? These are all things that children would hear very often. But they also learn perhaps new words in displaced context. So a child that doesn't know what is a turtle may hear their caregiver saying, shall we go and find a turtle outside? Or you enjoyed the merry-go-round yesterday, right? In a trip to the park, a caregiver and child went to the merry-go-round, and the child enjoyed it, but didn't hear the word at that point, and later on the caregiver mentioned. So these are the key questions. The hypothesis we are exploring here is that caregivers actually offer rich multimodal non-arbitrary input that can help children in learning and in processing in displaced contexts. Indeed, in particular, this input is non-arbitrary, that is iconic. And examples of these are, for example, a caregiver saying, using an onomatopoeia like meow, meow, talking about the cat when the cat is not there, or a caregiver modulating their use of intonation, of prosody, in an iconic manner. So, for example, saying going up, kind of mimicking the action, the motion upward, or they may use a representational gesture, namely a hand movement that maintain evokes imagistically properties of the referent. So, for example, a hand like this to talk about a pinch of salt to add to something. Now, so what we did in the work that I'm presenting is to look indeed whether that's the case, and that is whether caregivers are using these multimodal cues more often in displaced than in situated context. To do that, we use data from the ecolang corpus, and let me tell you what this is about. This is a semi-naturalistic interaction between a caregiver and their children that have been densely filmed and then annotated. And what we have in the corpus with respect to child-directed language is 70 dialects, caregiver child, and the children are between 2 and 4 years of age. We are focusing strictly here on the child-directed language. We're not looking at what the child does. What we do is what we have done is to go to the family home, get the two seated around the table, and then give them toys to talk about. The caregiver, the only instructions that they have is to talk about these objects and interact in the way they usually do with their child. Now, these objects are in part known, in part unknown to the child, and they are the red ones there are presumably unknown, and the blue ones are known to one child, and we establish what is known and unknown beforehand with the caregiver. Also, what we ask them to do is to talk for a little while when the objects are there, then we take them away, and with the excuse for them to continue to talk while we are going and get other objects, we ask them indeed to continue to talk about those objects that they've just seen. So what we have is for each set of objects, both how the communication unfolds when the objects are present and when the objects are absent, so that we can compare situated and displaced use of language. Okay, So here are some examples of the set of toys that we've been using. Simple ones, it's animals, tools, foods, and musical instruments. And they are always presented with a set of 6 toys from one of these class. And it's on the barbecue. And here is an example of an interaction, in this case with the object present.
It's on the barbecue. Yes. That was our leeks, wasn't it? And what did we do with the parsley?
And then they can go on the barbecue.
Oh, they go on the barbecue, yeah.
And the grapes.
Can the grapes go on the barbecue?
Yeah.
No.
Yeah.
Oh, they're fruit. That's going in our fruit salad, isn't it?
Yeah.
Could people online hear the video?
Sì, si sentiva bene.
Perfetto. Pazienza, ragazzi. Okay, anyway, the little girl probably will never be a cook, especially if she insists putting grapes on a barbecue. But I can tell you, she already sounds like a very good native speaker. Now, let's see what they do.
Can we cook our sausages?
Whoops. When the objects are not there.
Can we cook our sausages?
With a pan.
With pan, yes. We get them out of the fridge.
Mm.
We're going to put them on the grill.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we have a.
Turn the oven on. Oh, the sausages are nice and long, aren't they?
So we have
Nice long sausage.
So we have a barbecue here.
Oh, that's right. We cook sausages on the barbecue, don't we?
So we have a barbecue here.
Okay. Let's do a real barbecue. Okay, so let's get.
Right. So they really engage in the game. The toys are really cool. So they do have fun. And then what we do is to annotate what we have in the video. Particularly, we annotate the speech. We segmented it in utterances. We look at prosodic modulations in terms of acoustic measures, as well in terms of iconic prosody. We look at the vocalizations. We look at gestures, distinguishing between gestures that are iconic on the one hand, and then other type of gestures like points or beats. There are rhythmic gestures that do not bear meaning. We annotate when caregivers are holding objects and while they are communicating about the object to their child. And we're looking at eye gaze to the object and to the addressee. When I started this project, I was really hoping to do most of this automatically. The unfortunate reality is that we ended up doing most of it manually. Okay, so just a couple of general patterns. So first of all, these multimodal cues are very, very common in naturalistic interaction. So if you take just the manual cues, the gestures, the object manipulations, and so forth, you see that these are present well above 40% of the times in caregivers' production in the utterances. And in general, it is the case that caregivers tend to use these cues more with objects that are unknown to their child, hence in learning episodes, than when the words are known. Now, with respect to the iconic cues, what we were interested, what we focused on is production of onomatopoeias. And you have a couple of examples there, comparing the case in which the objects are present and the objects are absent. Then we looked at iconic prosody, and again, comparing, and in this case is long sausages, as you saw in the video before, to elongating the speech to coincide with the length of the object. And also, in addition, what we looked at is what I called word level or lexical iconicity here. So the onomatopoeias and iconic prosody provide somewhat very direct mapping from the sound in this case to properties of reference. But there are other forms of iconicity that have been documented in the language. And these are more at the level of phonemes. And these are links that are not necessarily just visual or auditory, can be multimodal, can be more complicated, more indirect. In English, courtesy of Bodo Winter, there's a kind of a normative data set for how iconic, like 40,000 words in the English language are. So what we did is for each utterance produced by the caregiver to identify the most iconic words, if there were, and if they were above a certain threshold, we call that utterance as iconic, or non-iconic if there were no words above a certain threshold. And again, we do this in displaced and in situated contexts. In the manual modality, as I said, we focus on representational gestures that again can be present both in displaced as well as situated contexts. And our prediction is that indeed these forms of iconicity would be more common in displaced and situated contexts, and more common potentially for unknown than for known referents, as they may help the learning. And then additional questions are, whether we see differences among the cues and whether we see developmental trends, given that the children are between 2 to 4. So it's a nice developmental time. Okay, so I'm skipping this, sorry, because we have lost a lot of time in technical issues. I'm happy to show you the examples later on. But here are the results. So here is for onomatopoeias. What you have in those violin plots is the proportion of utterances that contain an onomatopoeia over the total utterances for a given condition. What we've got here is separated for displaced and for situated, and in blue is known objects, in yellow is unknown objects. And what you can see for the onomatopoeias is that these are more common for situated, no, sorry, for displaced and unknown objects. There's also something else that is very interesting and has already been documented in the literature. That is, they are far more common for the younger children. Those that they are listed at less than 38 months than for the older children across the board. This is for the onomatopoeia. What about iconic prosody? Well, first of all, it's really infrequent. Okay, utterances that contain some form of, oh, it's such a long neck, or it's going up, they're not so common. But again, what we do see is that they are more common in displaced than they are in situated, and again, a little bit more common for unknown than known. If we look at lexical iconicity, this is quite common across the board. However, there's no significant difference between displaced and concurrent. It's used equally frequently, not only, there's actually not even a main effect or an interaction with known and unknown. So it's just used quite commonly by caregiver. Now, so what can we conclude? Well, indeed, first of all, indeed, as I said before, we see that onomatopoeia and iconic prosody is most often used for absent and unknown toys. Also, we see this nice developmental change for the onomatopoeia. And then, however, we do not see any difference between displaced and situated for lexical iconicity. And the way in which we are interpreting this difference between the other cues and lexical iconicity is in terms of how direct the iconicity is. The lexical iconicity is very subtle. It's very indirect. The other forms of iconicity are far more in your face, are far more direct. This is spoken modality. Let's move to manual modality. And here are the representational gestures. Here there's a whopping difference between displaced and situated, such that indeed the caregivers are using about an iconic representational gesture with more than 40% of their utterances when the object is displaced, but it's less than 1% of their utterances when the object is present. This is not to say that they don't use their hands when the objects are present, but they do other things. They manipulate the object, they point to the object. Okay, so they use different strategies. But when it is displaced, it's not that they just talk and do nothing with their hands. They use their hands a lot to imagistically evoke properties of the object that is not there. Okay, now, one question is, well, is this something that only caregivers do when they talk to their children, because it's a nice strategy to try to keep the child attention and to teach them something? Or is this something general that adults do as well when they talk to another? To what extent do adults, when they are not talking to children, also use these same iconic strategies? And we can answer this because the other part of our corpus involves the adult-adult conversation. So we can look at the same cues when an adult is talking to another adult. What we did here is very similar to what we did with the children. We got one person, and this is our designated speaker, and we asked them to come to the lab. This is in the lab, not in the homes. Excuse me. We asked them to come to the lab with a friend, their partner, someone familiar. And before they came to the lab, to the speaker, we trained them on the objects that they would be talking about to their partner during the interaction sessions. And these objects are all objects that are interesting in some ways. Okay, so that they have something to talk about rather than saying, oh, that's a, and stopping there, which is, yeah, what otherwise myself would do. But if they're talking about something that is more interesting, like a musical instrument, or indeed tools that are kind of being used in Roman times or things like that, then they talk more, which is what we want. Just like we did for the children, we have known and unknown objects to the partner. So the speaker is trained on the unknown one. They've been told what they are like. They've been showing documentaries about these objects in a quite naturalistic way, so that then they can talk about it and they learn the word. And again, just like for the children, what we do is to ask them to talk about these objects when the objects are there, present in front of them, and when they are absent. And here I have an example of the interaction between the two adults. In this case, the speaker is telling their partner about that animal there that is a cassowary.
They've got like massive claws on their feet. So they only eat like, yeah, so they only actually eat like fruit, like big fruit. Oh, okay. But they use it to slice it open. And they're the main way that like big fruit with big seeds, like they're the only birds that can eat seeds that big and stuff. So the only way they get dispersed. But it means that obviously if you get cut by the claws, they can be deadly because they're really sharp and then one these massive bird feet. Yeah.
So now you know what the cassowary is. And okay, and that's exactly what they do during the interaction, especially for the novel ones. Now, with the adults, first point is that there were too few onomatopoeias or cases of iconic prosody to be reported. So we focused on the representational gestures. And here I'm presenting the data from the children and the data from the adults side by side, showing that indeed, well, the adults do it too, and do it more or less to the same extent. So you do have the child-oriented language here. The pink is the displays, and the blue is the situated. And then likewise for the adults, and you see that the pattern is incredibly similar in the two groups. Also, what I'd like you to know from here is that, yes, indeed, they tend to use them more for unknown objects, but they use representational gestures a lot for known objects. Sorry, I might have said it wrong. What I meant to say is that they tend to use it more for unknown objects, but they use them a lot for known objects as well. Okay, so let me wrap up this part of my talk. What we see is that indeed, so the main point is, well, multimodality affords iconicity in a way that if we just look at the speech, we wouldn't be able to see. These iconic cues can bring to the mind eyes properties of reference in displaced context, and in this way they can support learning. They also can generally support communication, the development of a shared situation model while you are understanding someone speaking. And more generally, I mean, we can say that indeed, in a communicative context, that the displaced is made more situated by virtue of the affordances that the multimodal behaviors give to the speaker. Okay, now this is about communication, and now we are completely switching gears, okay, and address the question of indeed whether the brain process abstract and concrete words. Finally, I'm getting to abstract versus concrete differently in situated and displaced context. And this is work that has been carried out by my PhD students, Victor Koenig, who I really hope will finish this year, and in collaboration with a colleague, Jeremy Skipper, who is a proper neuroscientist. I'm not a proper neuroscientist. Okay, so far we have been looking pretty much at topic that concerns objects and actions, right? And looking at how indeed speaker communicate in displaced or in situated context for this type of words. But of course, whoops. Okay. But of course, abstract words can also be used and understood in displaced context, like in this case, but also in contexts in which they are situated in a specific, in a physical setting. So of course, the word truth acquires a specific meaning when we're talking about a certain politician who actually is quite likely to come back. And the word joy can refer to a specific type of event, like holding hands with friends watching the sunset. Now, the hypothesis that we are testing here is that actually the visual context is dynamically incorporated in the processing. And this has an interesting consequence. That is to make abstract concepts more concrete, more similar to concrete ones, and to make abstract concepts that when in a situated context, more similar to concrete ones, and vice versa, concrete concepts that are displaced, more similar to abstract ones. Okay, how did we go testing these hypotheses? Well, as I said, this is all work that looks at real-world languages. So here, what we did was to look at neural processing during movie watching. Okay, and in particular, we asked the following questions. First of all, during movie watching, we wanted to see whether when we ignore the context, and we look at abstract versus concrete words, we're going to replicate the type of activation findings that have been reported in the literature with respect to the distinction between concrete and abstract. This ignoring, I'm calling it context-free, ignoring the context. And this is important actually, because all the other studies have been done with very limited constrained stimuli. And so it's actually interesting to ask whether we can replicate these findings by looking at word processing while watching a movie in the scanner. And then we ask the question of what is the impact of context. And finally, we asked to what extent the context-dependent neural representations we get are similar to the context-free representations. Does it make sense? I'm going to, I know, I always, every time I present this work, I start mixing up context in one way or another. So please stop me and ask questions online and in presence. Right, so it's two different analyses. In one, we are ignoring the context. Okay, so we're just looking, we're just contrasting abstract word processing and concrete word processing and see whether we replicate the results that were reported before. And then instead, we take the context into account and we look at what happens. For now, we can put it this way.
Okay.
Okay, right. Okay, so we can do this because Jeremy and, well, this is work led by his PhD student, Sarah Lico, but Jeremy and his group have been made publicly available the neuroimaging data for about 90 participants, each of which have been watching one of these relatively popular full-length movies in the scanner. Okay, and in the database, there are very useful things that are already available there. So, for example, you have timestamps for each word in that is being said during the movie, so that you can kind of extract them and you can process those. And also, we improved on it, but available in the data set is object type frame by frame. And the objects that are present in the scene have been identified. Okay. In this way, you can really put into relationship what is being said and what they see in the scene. Now, I'm not going to go too much into the details. We can talk more later about how you analyze this type of data. This is all coming out from, we can say, the pioneering work that Jeremy has done on this data itself. But I mean, just to give you a bit of an idea, what you do is, first of all, to develop individual participants models. And these models are called amplitude deconvolution models. And they take a time window of 20 seconds, and they model the distinction between abstract and concrete. And we took the abstract and concrete distinction here from the Brisbane. Individual models takes into account the variable of interest is abstract versus concrete, plus regressors to take out variance related to low-level factors, and then the group analysis using LME, and we use a relatively conservative tree-shading approach. Okay, so first of all, here's what you see when you look across context. No context is being considered here, okay? This is what are the areas that are more engaged during the processing of concrete words versus the processing of abstract words, plus what are areas that are activated for both. So what you see is that for concrete words, this is the red areas here, and these are all regions that are involved in sensory motor processing. You have all of the central screen, you have a lot of occipital activation, you do have your, well, somewhat of the angular gyrus, you have area MT, motion concern, and so forth. So in a sense, this looks good. And for abstract words, you do have regions that are involved in processing internal type of information, autobiographical memory, and emotional processing. So in a sense, what we're doing here is to replicate broadly what's there in the literature. If we look at the areas that are active at different times for concrete and abstract, what we see is, well, big swathes of the visual cortex, probably related to the fact that our luminance control was not so good. So remember, they're watching movies, so there's a lot of visual stuff going on. But then, apart from that, what you see is superior temporal, inferior frontal, the language network. Okay, so this is all very good. What we did next, still looking at context-free, so this is again across all words, was to try to link the activations, the cluster of activations that we saw, a little bit more to the type of features, being sensory motors, being more internalized of the word themselves. And we did this doing what's called it's a peak and valley. So what you do when you do this is for each word, from the onset of a word, you take a 20 seconds time window, and just you look at the signal when it goes up and when it goes down. The idea is that when it goes up, you got a peak. And when you do have a peak, it means that whatever is from that word is being engaging more that part of the brain. Okay, when you have a valley inside, it's the opposite, it's engaged less. So here what we did was also for each word to define on the basis of the Lancaster norms plus the norms for valence and arousal to define what are the more important features that characterize the different words. And then what we did was very simply just to look at how many, what are the features that for each word are most important, and then relate these to the peaks so that we can see what are the most important features across the brain for abstract and for concrete words. And we can represent this in this way. So number of clusters tells you how important that those dimensions are. And what we do see is that for concrete clusters, well, we do get the type of features you would expect. Those are related to movement primarily. And for abstract cluster, you do get, in this case, a prevalence of valence and type of auditory features. Again, I'm happy, by the way, of course, because of the valence. So, but in general, we do see that this is not too dissimilar to what we see in the literature. Note also that for both, that's the yellow thing in there, that refers to the mouse. Now, in the Lancaster norms, whether someone was being, the mouse, our assumption is that it's taken to refer to language. And this is why we see that it is indeed present for both. Okay, so far so good. But again, I think interesting because we show that indeed these distinctions are there, even in very naturalistic type of process. Now, let's get to the meat and let's get to the modulations related to displacement. And here is what we did. So for each spoken word that we got the globe, the globe vector as its representation. Then, given a spoken word, we look at the 2 seconds before the spoken words. What objects are there? For each of these objects, we have their labels. And so we can get the globe vector for each of these labels. Then what we did was, sorry, I have it all here. Okay. Then what we did, we calculated an average globe vectors for the objects that were present before. And then we measured visual situatedness, the extent to which that word was situated versus displaced study based on the similarity, cosine similarity between the vector for the spoken word and the average vector for the objects that were there. And then categorize it. So if it is above a certain value, it's considered to be situated. If it is below a certain value, it's considered to be displaced. Okay, I have a couple of examples of situated, more or less concrete or abstract things. Okay, the first one is standing. There's no audio here, it's just so that because. Okay, and the next one is wandering. Maybe if I start it, be better. Okay, so you get a sense. I mean, this is all done automatically. I have no idea if they're all intuitive, you know, but that's what we did. Okay, so what we did was, again, to do analysis using the same methods that we did for the previous analysis, just that in this case, we have fewer words for conditions because we have 4 conditions of interest. And we have, and the 2 are there, so you have abstract words in situated context, abstract words in displaced context, concrete words in situated, concrete words in displaced. And we did exactly as we did before. And here is the map of the interaction between context and concrete abstract. Now, we need to break it down in order to make better sense of it. But I do want to point out that if you look at it, to me, this was striking. And the reason why it was striking is because the main network that is being, that comes out by looking at the interaction of the 2 variables is a default network. And this is represented here. And you see that, in fact, it involves pretty much, I mean, the resemblance is quite striking. And also, the other network being involved is a semantic control network. For those of you, there's a disagreement in the field as to what extent there is a semantic control network that is separable from the default mode network. I've been convinced by that, Jeffrey, that there are good reasons to separate it, but yeah, I think that anyway, the main player here is the default. Breaking down the interaction into the different conditions, as we've done here. So you have here for the abstract concepts, rightly situated, Bruce displaced, and there is for concrete concepts. You see that most of the activations that drive the interactions are actually occurring in the abstract displaced context, which is indeed when the default mode network is the most active. Now, I think that this is remarkable for the following reasons. Well, the default mode network has been long associated with mind wandering, with the internal cognition that is unrelated to sensory information or to the external world in general. Anatomically, in terms of physical distance in the brain, it is the network among those that have been described as related to cognition that is maximally distant from primary sensory and motor. So in a sense, it's really a network that we use when we are inner looking, when we are kind of detached from the actual physical context completely. And this is no surprise. These are abstract concepts that in and of itself do not evoke much in terms of physical properties, and they are displaced. So there's nothing to go by but the words. And this is what you see, again, in naturalistic processing, that I think is, again, quite interesting. Okay, now, the other thing that we did was to go a little bit further and try to, and compare in this case, the activations that we see in situated or displaced context to the activations that we see when we average. So when we do not take context into account. And here are the two key comparisons, right? So here are the areas of activation, so in situated abstract that kind of overlap with the areas of activation for the concrete across context conditions. And here you have the case of displaced concrete concepts that overlap with the overall abstract. And here I just want to show you the resemblance indeed between what you see here and what you see in that first map that I presented to you, where we look at the abstract and concrete words regardless of context. Okay? And so if you look at the situated abstract, you see that in fact these areas on the ventral stream, in the visual cortex, kind of overlap quite a bit to the red areas in the across context map. And likewise, when you look at the abstract words, you have a similar overlap. Now, let's quantify this. And we did quantify it very simply by just looking indeed at the spatial overlap between the voxels in one condition and in another. So here you have the overlap between the different, in this case, the different concrete and abstract words in situated or displaced conditions to the average concrete and abstract words. Does it make sense? Right. So what you see, and this is not surprising, is that when you do have a concrete concept and it is in a situated context, yes, this overlaps quite a bit with the average concrete sense. But what I think is striking is that ammetto.
No,
I just have to, okay. What is striking is that when you have an abstract word in a situated context, this will overlap quite highly with the average concrete. Okay? And this is in terms of spatial distribution. And the flip side is also the case. So when you do have a concrete word in a displaced context, you see that these will, what is most interesting here is this case, that it does overlap to, put it the other way around. So the point is when you do, sorry. No, that's all right. So when you do have a concrete displaced context, I thought I was going so well. Do you see what I mean here? Okay, I might have it wrong on my slide. Okay, because what actually, I think this is the one that I should have highlighted here. No, sorry, concrete displaced is more similar to, this is the one that I should have highlighted, right? Abstract displaced, no, sorry, yeah. Displaced concrete is more similar to abstract.
It's not more similar, but it's I really similar.
Okay. Okay.
It's more similar than concrete.
Exactly. Exactly. That was my point. I seem to have a curse that I always have to stumble in some way when I'm presenting this. Okay, but you got the point, and that's what matters. So let me just wrap up. So what we have seen is that communication differs in situated and displaced context, and we see that caregivers use iconic cues to bring to the mind eyes and displaced reference. And we see that this is not just something for caregivers, it's something that we see in adult diets as well. And that leads to my point that indeed face-to-face communication is always situated. It's situated in the social setting of the interaction when it's not also situated in the physical context. And then comprehenders process language differently in situated and displaced contexts. In particular, that indeed there are clear modulations and dynamic modulation during the online processing of these words in the brain, on how the brain indeed processes abstract and concrete words. And in particular, that concrete words in displaced contexts tend to become more abstract, and abstract words in situated contexts tend to become more concrete. I just want to finish with two very general points. And the first one is that I would urge the abstraction project and in general people to move beyond looking at languages just like speech or manual signs if you're looking at sign language, because all these non-linguistic behaviors are indeed part and parcel of communications, and they do matter. Also, I would urge you to go beyond the laboratory experiments in which you look at decontextualized language and try to think about using naturalistic tests that resemble more how language is used in everyday. And to speed up the process, I think it will be very, very important to share corpora and resources. So I'm just going to acknowledge my collaborators, my current lab members who have contributed to this work, a number of alumni and colleagues around the world who has also been involved, but in particular, all the interns and the student assistants without whom we would have been able to do all the annotation and so forth of the corpus. And thank you all for listening to me, and sorry for the various technical issues. Thank you.
Vediamo se ci sono delle
Allora, tolgo. No,
lascia pure. Ci sono delle domande qui dall'aula o da casa? Ah, c'è una domanda da Elisa Scerrati. Prego Elisa.
Buongiorno, le pongo la domanda in italiano o in inglese?
come vuoi.
Ok, buongiorno
Se c'è
prof.
qualche
Vigliocco.
inglese nella audience, shout now. If you're English speaker, shout now, and we will continue in English. Or we'll switch to Italian. Nobody's shouting, per cui continua pure in italiano.
Provo in italiano, ok. Innanzitutto la ringrazio per il suo talk, molto interessante. Io mi sono incuriosita dell'effetto che riportava sul fatto che gli oggetti noti abbiano prodotto più gesti rappresentazionali, insomma più gesti di rappresentazione.
No, è il contrario. Sono gli oggetti sconosciuti al bambino o anche all'adulto. Che,
ok, allora non mi era chiaro questo punto qui. Quindi sono gli oggetti sconosciuti quelli che hanno prodotto
gli oggetti
più...
sconosciuti che elicitano più gesti rappresentazionali.
Però ecco, anche in questo caso mi domandavo questo, i gesti rappresentazionali che sono stati fatti nel caso di oggetti appunto sconosciuti, che tipo di gesti erano? Nel senso, nell'interazione della diade adulto-bambino oppure adulto-adulto, comunque chi parlava conosceva in qualche modo l'oggetto per poterlo rappresentazionare.
Chi conosceva. Certo, chi parlava conosceva l'oggetto. Nella diade caregiver bambino, questo era chiaramente, questi sono oggetti conosciuti in generale. Nella diade adulto-adulto, uno dei due, quel che noi designiamo come speaker, gli abbiamo fatto vedere documentari, gli abbiamo descritto questi oggetti, eccetera, eccetera, dicendo, tra l'altro, abbiamo introdotto a loro anche quelli conosciuti, dandogli più informazioni di contesto in modo tale che poi potessero parlare di queste cose.
Ok, ok.
Se
La
vuoi
mia domanda...
ti faccio vedere il video che non ho fatto vedere prima, che è proprio carino.
Volentieri, sì, sì.
Ecco. Sì, sì, siamo ok. Ecco qua. No? Perché? Play.
The parrot goes, and at the bottom of his cage there was a little hedgehog snuffling around, looking for some milk and bread.
Ok, quindi hai tutta una serie di gesti, in questo caso hai anche sound effects, eccetera, che si sviluppano durante la comunicazione. Non è, allora, quello che non è, che secondo me è anche importante, non è che i genitori dicono, ok, adesso ti insegno queste parole. No, le descrivono, creano scenari, le descrivono in questo modo. E anche l'adulto, se vuoi, ti rifaccio vedere questo del cassowary. In particolare questa speaker qua usa una quantità di gesti enorme. Comunque, eccola qua.
They've got like massive claws on their feet, so they only eat like, yeah, so they only actually eat like fruit, like big fruit. But they use it to slice it open, and they're the main way that like big fruit with big seeds, like they're the only birds that can eat seeds that big and stuff, so the only way they get dispersed. But it means that obviously if you get cut by the claws, they can be deadly because they're really sharp and then one these massive bird feet.
Ok.
Certo, perché il mio punto era proprio questo, cioè più gesti si riescono, diciamo così, a fare, tanto più si conosce l'oggetto. Quindi...
certo, per questo, cioè, allora, l'idea è che veramente quello che i gesti fanno non è soltanto insegnare la fonologia, ma è insegnare aspetti concettuali dell'oggetto, in modo tale che, insomma, la fonologia possa essere attaccata alla semantica, cioè, e sviluppare allo stesso tempo, permettono di sviluppare la semantica dell'oggetto data una parola tipo cassowary che potrebbe essere altrimenti sconosciuta.
Capito, capito, grazie mille.
Niente. Grazie a te. Altre domande?
Altre domande? Io ne ho qualcuno, ma me la tengo per dopo l'ora di pranzo.
No, ma ok,
Prego.
ho detto che magari ero un po' in ritardo, per cui c'è qualcun altro che prende il posto al
Io so che un po' di domande.
Mi alzo, tranquilla.
No, volevo sapere, intanto grazie per il talk, qualcosa riguardo i visual relatedness che avete utilizzato nell'estrazione dei diplomi fondamentalmente. Mi chiedevo se non ci potesse essere un bias, comunque il fatto che il visual relatedness, che sappiamo che i concetti che pensano molto visuali rispetto agli estratti, soprattutto in virtù del fatto che i concetti estratti comunque descrivono qualcosa che ha una dinamica che può anche cambiare nel tempo. Quindi io come se avete tenuto conto di questa cosa nell'assegnare il punteggio, nell'assegnare il...
Allora, abbiamo scelto 2 secondi perché tenendo presente anche il volt signal, eccetera, e no, non l'abbiamo considerato. Allora, di fatto per quanto riguarda il processamento delle parole, c'è ancora tanto lavoro che può essere fatto, perché quello che abbiamo fatto è di prendere 20 secondi, che è una finestra temporale molto ampia. In tutti i modelli è modellato secondo per secondo, per cui 20 condizioni in questo caso, però poi alla fine li abbiamo messi tutti a fuoco. Ok? Perché e ci sono differenze nella dinamica dei diversi concetti dentro questi 20 secondi. Però questo è un lavoro per un altro giorno. Perché è un lavoraccio. Okay? Ecco, però non so, a livello di biases, non lo so. Chiaro che è più facile magari avere un aspetto visivo, fisico, che è relato, che ha un'altra somiglianza a una parola concreta piuttosto che astratta, però in gloss trovi concetti che corrispondono alle 4 posizioni, cioè che hanno un alto livello di situatedness e sono astratti. Quella è la condizione, però è vero, quella è la condizione che ci ha limitato di più, e questo è il motivo per cui alla fine non avevamo fatto di parole, anche perché tieni presente di nuovo, a parte quello, controlliamo per frequenza, lunghezza della parola, familiarità, eccetera, eccetera. Quindi, sì, diciamo, è meno probabile, però non credo che abbiamo introdotto un bias.
No, se pensiamo comunque che magari non so che altri autori si potrebbero utilizzare, però magari basando su altre modalità potrebbero, per questo che leggeva chiaramente classe nella direttiva.
Sì. Tieni presente che quello è anche quello che dicevo prima, noi abbiamo soltanto un regressore di luminance, ok? Per cui uno può pensare di usare regressori più sofisticati per escludere aspetti visivi che però non sono a livello dell'oggetto. Okay? Per cui credo che il fatto che abbiamo queste attivazioni massicce a livello occipitale è anche legato a questo. Okay? Per fortuna non sono le attivazioni più interessanti e più importanti dal nostro punto di vista, per cui speriamo che i reviewer pensino lo stesso. Allora, certo.
Se è migliore discorso. Forse se c'è un bias un po' significante dal fatto che i contesti estratto oggetti con correnti, con parole che corrispondono a oggetti concreti, probabilmente c'è più consistenza negli oggetti titolari. Ovviamente la parola l'auto in 6 film avrà una occorrenza di non so, X volte nel primo, X volte nel secondo, eccetera. Quindi quando vado a prendere i contesti di gatto, molto probabilmente ritroverò e quindi utilizzerò anche dei vettori di alcuni progetti che molto spesso saranno più simili, non possono essere stessi, ma probabilmente simili, perché invece nei contesti delle parole che capitano concetti astratti ci sarà sparsità.
Possibile.
Abbiamo una domanda da casa.
Scusa un attimo, volevo soltanto dire una cosa. Tutto quello che ho presentato, tranne la descrizione del corpus, perché in questo momento è under review e sto per renderlo disponibile a tutti, è depositato nella library, però sto aspettando che, speriamo, che appunto che questo venga pubblicato e poi lo rendo disponibile a tutti. Ma gli altri lavori, l'articolo, tutti i dati, tutto il code che è stato utilizzato, eccetera, è disponibile su PsychArchive e su BioArchive per i 2 articoli principali.
Benissimo, grazie. C'è una domanda da casa da Elisa Lugli che dice non riesce a far funzionare il microfono, quindi te la leggo. Dice, mi chiedevo se oltre alla tipologia di gesti e o descrizione linguistica fosse stato rilevato anche la quantità di gesto versus quantità di parlato tra situated e displaced, ipotizzando che nell'ultimo caso abbiamo più bisogno delle parole.
Allora,
La quantità di gesto.
sì, 2 parti a questa domanda. Una è che non me la ricordo proprio. Comunque, cerchiamo di ricostruirla. Ma l'altra è che le proporzioni che vi ho mostrato controllano per la quantità di parlato, perché sono proporzioni del numero di utterances che contengono un gesto sopra il numero di utterances per quell'oggetto in quella condizione. Per cui tengono presente la quantità di parlato. Ora, rispetto al numero di utterances, questa me la devo riguardare. Se mi mandi un'email ti mando i risultati e credo che sia nell'articolo comunque, però la mia memoria è che io mi ricordo che di fatto parlano di meno, solo i caregivers parlano di meno quando l'oggetto non è presente rispetto a quando l'oggetto è presente, che probabilmente è un motivo molto semplice, che il bambino si distrae di più quando gli oggetti non sono lì, per cui bisogna che questi sono piccolini, per cui semplicemente cioè, l'adulto deve cambiare discorso. Comunque appunto se mi mandi un'email o forse guarda sull'articolo dovrebbero esserci grafici corrispondenti sul numero di utterances che hai in situated and displaced.
Esatto, sì. Luisa ha risposto, certo, grazie, penso che ti spiegherà.
Ok, benissimo.
Ok, direi che siamo
Volevi chiedere
nei
qualcosa?
tempi.
Vai, chiedi.
No,
Chiedi.
Utilizzato il classico corpus. Avete scelto una soglia, per cui il concetto o era stato. Mi chiedevo se non ci fosse invece un modo per evitare questa discussione dicotomica di cui tanto si discute e se, soprattutto nei film, c'erano delle differenze tra domini semantici, no? Quindi e delle relazioni.
Non l'abbiamo guardato. Non lo so.
Tipi di astratte, anche
Non lo
la
so.
mia domanda ma
No, non lo so, non l'abbiamo guardato.
È vero che i concetti astratti possono riferirsi come però qua no? Perché magari quelli che hanno dei punteggi molto alti nei corpus.
Sì, allora, credo che sarebbe difficile fare queste distinzioni più fini visto il tipo di dati, temo, perché hai bisogno di avere, cioè perché questo è noisy. Per cui hai bisogno di un buon numero di parole per poter, però sì, certo, hai ragione, no, non lo devo guardare.
Va bene. Continuiamo le nostre
Grazie.
conversation.
E di nuovo, grazie a quelli.
E ringrazio tutti i partecipanti a casa e alla prossima troverete informazioni sui prossimi seminari organizzati da Abstraction, sempre sul nostro canale media, social media e sul website di Abstraction. Grazie, arrivederci.